Awesome. Good morning, friends. Welcome to episode 3 of Pantry Place. Joy, can you confirm that you can hear me through Facebook real quick? Just want to make sure we've got sound. Go check that. Don't want any technical difficulties happening here. All right. I'm real excited to share this recipe with y'all today. And actually, if anyone is watching, you can drop in the chat and let us know if you can hear us. That would be fantastic. This smells amazing. Yes, we have sound. I just heard myself. Okay, great. Okay. So I need to all right. Okay, there. That's better. I could hear myself. Okay, I'm not sure what's going on, but it's fine. I'm going to continue. Okay, so November is Native American Heritage Month, and we are going to be highlighting a really great recipe that uses the Three Sisters. Okay, I need to pause real quick.
Is that not working?
Yeah, it's not working. Hold, please, friends. I don't know what's going on. It started to play my podcast in my ear. And I don't understand. It's not open. Okay. Come on, food. There we go. Yeah, it's playing me on Facebook in my ear, and it's the delay, and that's never happened before. I know are we still live?
Yep.
Okay. Hold on, friends, we're getting there. I don't even know if they can hear me. Do you have any comments in the chat box?
I just said we're having technical difficulties.
I can't. I'm just going to leave this off or turn it all the way down.
Is it still playing your podcast?
It just made the noise like it came back on. It's not playing it now. Okay.
Keep going. I think you're good. Just don't tap it.
Okay. Sorry about this, friends. I was hearing myself in my ear, and that's not how it's supposed to work. Let's start over. Thank you for tuning in. Okay. To highlight that again, these three items grow together synergistically, so they support each other. So the Native Americans would plant the corn, and the corn would act as a stake for the bean plants to crawl up the corn. And so that helped the beans reach the sun, and then the beans would put more nitrogen into the soil, and that would fertilize the corn and the squash. And then squash leaves are really big fan leaves, and they're also really prickly. So they help to keep pests and other things away while also trying to shield too much sun on the squash. So they worked together completely synergistically, and that is the three sisters and why they're so important. So I've got my squash in the pot. I'm going to go ahead and add my beans. I'm working with pinto beans today, but you can use any type of beans. And this is 2 cups. So 2 cups is about 1 can of beans. And then my corn, this is frozen corn, and it's 2 cups of frozen corn already thawed. So I'm going to add all my veggies, and then I'm going to add 2 cups of vegetable stock to make sure that it cooks all together. So fun fact about this vegetable stock, I bought a little jar of vegetable stock base that makes 9 quarts of stock. So if you find that, and that's available to you, you could keep that little jar of stock base in your refrigerator, and that can serve you much longer than buying individual boxes of stock. So you can get like 4 times the amount of stock out of 1 jar. That costs about $5, depending on the brand that you choose. And then you can have more stock for much longer. Okay, so there is the base of my 3 sisters. Got my corn and my squash and my beans in here. So I'm going to just bring it to a boil. And then once it's boiling, I'm going to put the lid on it and let it simmer for about 15 minutes. So we'll see how well this times out for being completed during our video, but butternut squashes take a little bit of time. So let's jump into that. I'm going to put my lid on to help increase how fast it will boil. Okay, let's move our camera over here so we can highlight this butternut squash. Okay, so first things first, butternut squash is a winter squash along with pumpkin and acorn squash. There's so many different varieties. And the way that you process it depends on the exterior of the skin and how smooth it is. Like acorn squash is really lumpy on the outside and you can't skin that squash very easily. So that's one that you would not peel. For this instance, our butternut squash, there's two different ways to prepare it. One way is if you are going to make puree, and the second way is if you want to get cubed squash. So for our dish today, we use cubed butternut squash. So I'm first going to start showing you how to peel it, and then I'll talk about what you need to do if you're going to make puree. And I'll just hint, you don't need to peel it to make puree. It takes much less time to do that. So what I like to do is I like to cut off the top and the bottom. So do you see how smooth that is? That's not usually how easy that works. So what you can do if your squash is really hard and you are fighting to cut through it, you can put it in the microwave for about 5 minutes. So be sure to poke it a few times with a knife so any steam can come out and it doesn't pop in your microwave. 5 minutes should not make it pop, but just for safety reasons, make sure that you poke some holes. So I just poked a couple of holes here. I cut off my top and my bottom. So the way that I like to do it, there's not one right way. I like to cut it in half between the skinny section and the bottom wider section. It makes it easier to peel. So you might have to do some rocking here to get this cut in half. Now we've got our two sections. So this wider section has the seeds inside of it, just like any other winter squash. So pumpkin has seeds inside, acorn, they all have seeds. So, but what you want to do is make sure you peel it before you start to cut it. So you can use a knife or you can use a vegetable peeler. So the goal here is to peel it enough to make sure that the green lines underneath the skin come off. So when you're using a peeler, you may have to do it double time because the peeler only goes so deep. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. So okay, so maybe you can see this. You can see that there are some green lines here. That's what I'm talking about. You want to peel it so that the green lines are gone. So the peeler doesn't do it in one swoop. So you want to go back behind yourself and do it one more time. You want the sides to look the same orange color as the top looks after you cut off the ends. Huh? So technically, like in technical terms, I don't know why, but that is a rule of thumb that I use for my mother-in-law for root vegetables. And I'm treating this as a root vegetable, though it's not. When it comes to sweet potatoes, if you do not peel it deep enough, the remnants of the skin on the outside can turn black when the air touches it. So she peels her sweet potatoes with a knife so she can control how deep it goes. And then she wants it to be the same color as the inside flesh. So yeah, so I don't actually know if that applies to butternut squash, but it's what I do. Thanks for asking. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, so you want to just peel it just like so. Make sure your fingers are out of the way.
While she's doing that, I'll tell you my reason why I like to peel it with all the time that I have kind of sensitive skin, and there's an enzyme underneath the like in the skin, in that like green and a little bit like lighter peach, and it like irritates my skin when I hold on to the squash to chop it up. So that's why I'm always really careful to make sure that I peel it all off.
I love that perspective, and I wasn't aware of that because I don't have that sensitivity. So that's really good for people to know. If you happen to notice that, that is a good reason why you should peel it off. So I'm showing you the knife method now. My mother-in-law, she's particular about the way that she peels things, and so I don't often like to use the knife because you can go too deep and take too much of the meat, as she says, or the flesh of the squash or the sweet potato. But you can definitely do this way. So it takes less time because you don't have to go over it several times like you would with the peeler. There you go. Okay, so I'm just gonna go real quick and get all this skin off, just like so. So this is the reason why I cut it in half and between the skinny part and the wider part is because it's easier to work with. So when you're peeling it, if you were peeling it down like this, you would have to go around the bowl at the bottom. So it makes it much easier for you to have a flat surface to work on. And the same thing goes for cutting off the top and the bottom. Having that flat surface is very safe. Cool. The squash is a little bit warm. We got a little pre-cooked there. Okay, so when you want cubes, first thing you're gonna do is peel it just like we did. And then you will take your tall skinny part and you're gonna cut it into slabs. I like to call it slabs or slices. So you're gonna cut it in this direction and you want to decide how big you want your cubes to be. If you want bigger cubes, you're gonna cut wider sections on this piece here. So I'm going to, for this recipe, we wanted 1/2 inch. So here's my slab. So it's like this thick. So then you want all of your pieces to be very similar thickness. So I don't usually cut it this way with one hand. I'll get it embedded into the squash and then I'll use my other hand to push it down because of how thick and hearty this vegetable is. Okay, so I'm gonna do it again. There. And then this guy is a little too wide, but I think it's gonna be okay. Because if I cut it a little bit more thin, I'm going to have a really skinny piece and I don't need that. So it's okay if this is a little bit too wide. So from here, what you will do is stack your slabs on top of each other. So these two on the end that are not flat, I usually put them to the side and I'll do them in a second round. You've got your slabs. So now we're gonna cut it into sticks. So this is also going to, you're going to decide how big you want this to be based on how big you want your cubes to be. So I'm going to do about 1/2 inch. So these guys are going to slide on each other if you notice that. So that's why I like to use that two-hand method to put some pressure on it to keep it from moving around. Okay, one more slice. Okay, so there's all my sticks. They're all about the same size. So then you're going to take those, hold them together with your hand, and then you're just going to cut it into pieces. Just like so. So these are all very similar in size. Oops, where's the camera? There it is. Okay. So that's how you work with the thinner side of the squash. Now, I'm going to move this back over to my bowl and I'm going to show you how to take care of the other side. Okay. So this is the side that has the seeds in it. So all you're going to do is you're going to cut it in half. And there's your seeds. So all you need to do is scoop these out like you would if you were carving a pumpkin. I'm just going to scoop right around the edges. This smells so nice and sweet because it's in season. It smells delicious. Okay, so scrape the edges there. and then dump it in the trash. You don't have to actually dump it in the trash. If you want to save these seeds and give them a good clean and let them get dried out, you can roast them just like you would pumpkin seeds. They have very similar nutrition quality with some healthy fats. So keep that in mind. You don't have to toss those. Same goes for the other side. Okay. So then after you do that, you're going to, I got little seeds all over the place now. Also, be aware that your hands may turn orange. So if you've got gloves, you can do that. Otherwise, you're just going to have some orange fingers. Unless you want a tan. That's a good point. So you're going to treat this the same way you treated the skinnier side of the squash, except you're going to have some extra bits on the edges as you make your slices. So you don't have to cut this into planks because it's a hollow piece. So I'm cutting it into little wedges. And then from here, you're going to have these sort of like half moon shape. They're going to be all different shapes. And then you cut it from here. So I like to cut off like the little edge that sticks off and makes it uneven. And then you'll cut it the rest of the way. It's not going to be perfectly cubed the way your other piece was, but it doesn't matter. As long as it's a similar size, because it will cook within the same amount of time. Okay, so just like so. Okay, so that's how you cut that part of the squash. So I want to go back and talk to you about how you make puree. I'm not going to go really deep into this, but when you make puree from a butternut squash, you'll take your whole squash and you'll cut it in half long ways, and you can leave the skin on it. So then you have your 2 halves of squash. You'll scoop out the seeds and everything, and then you can oil that side of your squash if you would like to, and then you are going to put it into a pan face down and bake it in the oven until your squash is really tender. Then you can put it in a blender and make some puree out of it. Joy shared this really cool thing that I'd never thought of, and it's really smart. If the dish that you are going to make with your squash puree calls for garlic, you can take the skin off of the cloves, and then as you set down your cut side of your squash into the pan, you can put your garlic cloves inside the little hole, and they're going to cook with the rest of the squash. So it's very similar to roasted garlic, which has this amazing flavor that it turns sweet and it spreads like butter. So you could kill 2 birds with 1 stone, for lack of a better reference, and get some yummy roasted squash and garlic at the same time. So that, my friends, is how you cut a squash. I'm curious to know if there's anyone who does something differently. I'd love to learn from the way you like to cut. Or do you just buy it already cut at the grocery store? Because that's super convenient, but it is going to cost you a little bit more money. It'll actually be the same price probably as a whole squash, but you're not going to get the same amount of squash out of it. You're going to get much less squash if you buy it already chopped. Okay, let's take a look over here. It kind of seems like it's trying to boil, but there's a good bit of food in the pot. There it is. It is boiling. All right. This smells delicious. Okay. So the step-by-step instructions that I just shared with you on how to cut your butternut squash can be found in our nutrition resources folder. And we will share that link on the screen in just a minute. So in that folder, you can navigate to the videos and find our Pantry to Plate folder. And I've got all the resources shared related to this recipe. So this is the recipe. It's 3 Sisters squash, succotash. And it's going to be found in a recipe book in that folder. So the book is called Young, Indigenous, and Healthy, and it was developed by Leah's Pantry out of California. alongside many of their Indigenous community members. So the recipes are modernized about this much, and they're as similar as they can be to the recipes that Native Americans have prepared for their families. So this recipe, it takes about 35 minutes. I will say that if you are trying to include the amount of time that it takes to cut your squash, I think it will take a little bit longer depending on how comfortable you are with your squash. So keep that in mind. You can use other types of squash here. It doesn't have to be butternut squash, but consider your winter squashes for this dish. So summer squash like zucchini and yellow squash that we see along in our region is very common in Southern food. You can use that in this dish, but it's going to be a different texture because those two have a much higher water content than our winter squashes have. Okay, we are boiling here now. Okay, so you can also add meat to this dish. This dish, as written, is technically vegan. There are no animal products here. So traditionally, Native American people would use game meat, whatever was available in their area. But you can also use game meat if that's something that's common to your foodways, or if your family maybe hunts deer in the deer hunting season and you have things like that. That would line up to like the way Indigenous folks would have cooked it. You can also add some ground beef if that's what you have available, or some chicken that's already been cooked, and you can toss it in at the end to heat it all through. So that is a couple of ideas on how to use this recipe. I would love for you to take a look at the cookbook, Young, Indigenous, and Healthy. There are a lot of cool recipes that you may not think about, like a wild rice and blueberry salad. That sounds delicious. So I would love for you to take a look at that. I think we're getting really close to this being done over here. Let's take a look at it. Whew. Okay, we are boiling. All right, so I mean, at this point, all you're doing is waiting for your squash to cook all the way through. And then once your squash is tender, it doesn't really take that much time for the squash. Considering how hard it is to start with, it doesn't take more than like 20 minutes for it to get nice and tender. Once you do that, you can take off your lid and let the liquid cook down if you don't want it to be really saucy. When you do that, you will maybe get a little extra caramelization on the vegetables as you let the liquid cook off of it. So that's just an idea. It will take a little more time if you would like for that to cook off all the way. This is pretty done. I think it could go just another couple minutes. Yeah, not much more, but that is so good. The squash is so sweet, and the savory flavor from the smoked paprika really goes really well with the sweetness of the squash. I'm gonna back this up because occasionally my phone will get too hot, so we're gonna just do that. So I saved some of the bell pepper from the dish. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier. This was in the onion step at the beginning. You save some of the chopped bell pepper and you can put that on top. So you have like a really fresh crunch as a topping for your dish. And then you also serve this with lime wedges to balance out the sweet and savoriness of the squash and the smoked paprika. The smoked paprika adds this kind of meaty, it's not meaty, but more savory flavor because that is generally associated with like bacon and smoked meats and stuff like that. So it really adds that extra level of savory flavor that you think you might miss if you don't have a meat in your dish. Okay. Okay, so just remember you can also find the The recipe in our folder for this episode, the whole cookbook is there. So there are many recipes that are really interesting and related to a Native American neighbors here. If you're interested in learning about what Native American tribes may have lived on your property previously, I linked a website where you can type in your address and it will zoom in and show you what tribes were there. So for us, generally, the food bank is sitting on top of Muskogee land, and the majority of Georgia is Muskogee land. So most of us will probably fall into that category. But if you're just curious, it could be cool for you to take a look at that and see how many varieties of Indigenous people were here before the settlers moved them out. And I would be remiss if I did not mention how terrible that was. It really stripped Indigenous people away from their cultures and the lives that they built on land that was familiar to them. So they really had to completely start over when they were moved out west. So that shows how resilient they are, but it was a little bit of forced resilience. But I digress. Okay, we're right at 30 minutes. Do we have any questions or comments in the chat box, Joy? I'm gonna turn this down. It's a roaring boil over here.
Yeah, but I'm gonna link to that.
The map?
Yeah.
Cool. There we go. So you can also, without stabbing the squash to check it, it will start to be really soft as you stir the pot. So you're gonna see it kind of falling apart. It smells so good. I haven't added any salt to this dish because my vegetable base that I use to make the broth is a full salt product. So I decided to leave any extra salt out, and then I would add some if it needed it at the end. Also, you can very leniently, liberally, I don't think lenient's the word, season with pepper at the end. And if you like spicy, you could add a hot pepper at the beginning when you saute the onions. That would be really delicious as well. There's my liberal salting. I meant peppering. Oh my goodness. Okay. That squash is definitely done. Let me get a little bowl. Let me give you a little oven mitt, Joy, because it's going to be really hot. I'm going to give you a lime wedge and a couple little pieces of fresh pepper for a little crunch. There's a little serving size.
Gorgeous.
It is gorgeous. All right. Go. Super hot. We're going to get some feedback from Joy.
Let it cool off a little bit first. But you know what I was thinking? This is such a nice dish because there's a lot of ingredients here that we would commonly find like at a food pantry, or that I would commonly like things that I like to keep at home as staples, like beans and corn, and I like to keep this canned. So you could just like add those together really quickly if you wanted to, and gosh, this looks so healthy, and the colors even look very like fall, like with
I was thinking that too with it being fall. I was thinking the same thing about how well this just soaks up the awesome colors of like the leaves that we're seeing, like the yellow and the orange and the red leaves. Also, you can substitute something for the squash. If butternut squash is not something that you have available, you can use sweet potato. Absolutely. That is going to be cheaper for one, and maybe even more available to you than butternut squash. And it takes a little less time to process. But also keep in mind, so this is a huge pot, and it said that it made 4 servings. 4 1-cup servings. So that completely, yes, Joy was like, what? It completely depends on the size of your squash. So the recipe tells us that it says a small butternut squash, but it doesn't tell us how big a small squash is. So I picked the smallest one that I could find, but in the scheme of things, I don't really think it was small. So if you want to cube up the whole squash and then just visually decide how much squash you want to use, like based on the ratio of beans to corn. That's something to consider. Or you could just use half of the squash and save half of the cubed squash for another dish. So that's something to consider as well. You can stretch that squash over more than one dish.
Kristen, this is delicious. The flavors, the way the flavors are layered here, we've got the sweetness of the butternut squash, which is incredibly, like, way sweeter than I was expecting.
Yes.
And then the, like, smokiness and the umami savory flavor from the smoked paprika, the saltiness from the beans, and the crunch and the salt, and even the like tartness from the lime. It's a really well balanced recipe. I'm shocked how much I like it.
Or did you come in a little skeptic today?
I think this is not the kind of thing that I would probably pick from a recipe book, but it's the kind of thing that now that I've tasted it, I will probably go and make it because I like it that much. And then I was also thinking that, this would be a really nice thing to have around Thanksgiving time, just to kind of honor the Native Americans who kind of get left out of the Thanksgiving story, or whose perspective a lot of times is left out of the Thanksgiving story. So this could be one way to pay homage to them.
Absolutely. That's the whole goal of Native American Heritage Month, right? Mm-hmm. Not that we should only pay attention to our Indigenous neighbors during this time, but maybe this will just bring it to your mind and you'll think about it a little bit more often.
But whatever kind of significance you want to put on this dish, I highly recommend you try it at home because it is fantastic and super easy to do.
Yeah, there's something special about the lime juice.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. It really brings the whole flavor of the dish together with the lime juice.
Yum.
Okay, we're going to stop making you just like watch me eat over here. We appreciate your patience at the beginning of our video with our technical difficulties. Happens to the best of us. We are going to be back the week after Thanksgiving on that Tuesday for a special Giving Tuesday themed episode. So we're going to be talking about Thanksgiving leftovers and how to use them differently. So you don't have to keep eating the Thanksgiving meal over and over and over again, unless you like it, because I like to eat it like at least twice and then I'm done. So how can you reuse your leftovers in a new and exciting way? So tune in on November 30th for Giving Tuesday and special Thanksgiving leftover ideas. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you soon. Hope you have a great holiday with your family and your friends. See you later.